Johnny Ludlow, first series by Mrs. Henry Wood. Johnny Ludlow, first series, 1874, consists of 26 short, self-contained stories. Each chapter explores different events, mysteries, and social issues, with Johnny Ludlow either observing or participating. You can enjoy each story individually, making this series perfect for watching one chapter at a time. Part 10, Chapter 19, David Garth's Night Watch. It was the following year, and we were again at Crabcott. Fever had broken out at Dr. Frost's, and the school was dismissed. The leaves were falling late that year, for November was nearly half through, and they strewed the ground. But if the leaves were late, the frost was early. The weather had come in curiously cold. 3 days before the morning I am about to speak of, the warm weather suddenly changed, and it was now as freezing as January. It is not often that you see ice mingling with the dead leaves of autumn. Both the ice and the leaves have to do with what happened. And I think you often find that if the weather is particularly unseasonable, we get something by which to remember it. At the corner of a field between our house and North Crab stood a small solitary dwelling called Willow Brook Cottage. But the brook from which it took its name was dry now. The house had a lonely look and was lonely, and perhaps that kept it empty. It had been unoccupied for more than a year, when the squire, tired of seeing it so, happened to say in the hearing of James Hill, that new bailiff of ours, that he would let it for an almost nominal rent. Hill caught at the words and said he would be glad to rent it. For some cause or other he did not like the house he was in, and had been wanting to leave it. At least he said so, but he was of a frightfully stingy turn, and we all thought the low rent tempted him. Hill, this working bailiff, was a steady man, but severe upon everyone. It was during this early frost that he began to move in. One morning after breakfast, I was taking the broad pathway across the fields to North Crab, which led close by Willow Cottage, and saw Hill wheeling a small truck up with some of his household goods. He was a tall, strong man, and the cold was tolerably sharp, but the load had warmed him. "Good morning, Master Johnny. Making ready for the flitting, Hill?" Hill wheeled the truck up to the door, and sat down on one of the handles whilst he wiped his face. It was an honest, though cross face, habitually red. The house had a good large garden at its side, enclosed by wooden palings, with a shed and some pigsties at the back. Trees overshadowed the palings, and the fallen leaves, just now, inside the garden and out were ankle-deep. "A fine labor I shall have, getting the place in order," cried Hill, pointing to some broken palings and the overgrown branches. "Don't think but what the squire has the best of the bargain after all. You'd say that, Hill, if he gave you a house rent-free." Hill took the key from his pocket, unlocked the door, and we went in. This lower room was boarded. The kitchen was at the back. Above were 2 fair-sized chambers. One of them looked towards Crab Ravine. The other was only lighted by a skylight in the roof. "You have had fires here, Hill." "I had 'em in every room all day yesterday, sir, and am going to light 'em again now. My wife said it must be done, and she warn't far wrong, for a damp house plays the mischief with one's bones. The fools that women be, to be sure, and my wife's the worst of 'em." "What has your wife done?" "She had a bit of an accident yesterday, Master Johnny. Coming out with a few things for this place, she stepped upon some ice, and fell. It gave her ankle a twist, and she had to be helped home. I'm blessed if she's not saying now that it's a bad omen, because she can't get about and help shift the things in here. She says we shan't have nothing but ill luck in the place." I had already heard of the accident. Hill's wife was a little shrinking woman, mild and gentle, quite superior to him. She was a widow when he married her a short time ago, a Mrs. Garth, with one son, David. Miss Timmins, the schoolmistress at North Crab, was her sister. On the previous morning a letter had come from Worcester, saying their mother, Mrs. Timmins, was taken dangerously ill, and asking them to go over. Miss Timmins went. Hill refused for his wife. How could he get along at moving time without her? He demanded. She cried and implored, but Hill was hard as flint. So she had to remain at home, and set about her preparations for removal. Surly Hill was master and mistress too. In starting with the first lot of movables, a few things carried in her arms, the accident occurred. So that in the helping to move, she was useless, and the neighbors, ever ready to take part in a matrimonial grievance, said it served Hill right. Anyway, it did not improve his temper. "When do you get in here, Hill?" "Tomorrow, Master Johnny, please the pigs. But for the wife's awkwardness, we'd ha been in today. As to any help Davy could give, it's worth no more nor a rat's. He haven't got much more strength in him, nor one neither." "Drat the boy!" Leaving Hill to his task, I went on, and in passing Mrs. Hill's dwelling, I thought I'd give a look in to inquire after the ankle. The cottage stood alone, just as this other one did, but was less lonely, for the crab houses were round about. Davy's voice called out, "Come in." He was the handiest little fellow possible for any kind of housework, or for sewing, either, but not half strong enough or rough enough for a boy. His soft brown eyes had a shrinking look in them. His face was delicate as a girl's, and his hair hung in curls. But he was a little bit deformed in the back. Some called it only a stoop in the shoulders, and though 14, might have been taken for 10. The boy's love for his mother was something wonderful. They had lived at Worcester. She had a small income, and he had been well brought up. When she married Hill, all her friends were against it, and it was in fact a frightful mistake. Of course they had to come to North Crab, but Davy was not happy. Always a timid lad, he could not overcome his first fear of Hill. Not that the man was unkind, only rough and resolute. Davy was washing up the breakfast things. His mother sat near, sorting the contents of a chest. A neat little woman in a green stuff gown, with the same sweet eyes as David and the same shrinking look in them. She left off when I went in and said her ankle was no worse. "It's a pity it happened just now, Mrs. Hill. I'd have given a great deal for it not to, sir. They call me foolish, I know. Always have done, but it just seems to me like an omen. I had a few articles in my arms, the first trifles we'd begun to move, and down I fell on going out at this door. To me it seems nothing but a warning that we ought not to move into Willow Cottage." David had halted in his work at the teacups, his brown eyes fixed on his mother. That it was not the first time he had listened to the superstition, and that he was every whit as bad as she, might plainly be seen. I have never liked the thought of that new place from the first, Master Johnny. It is as if something held me back from it. He'll keep saying that it's a convenient dwelling, and dirt cheap. And so it is, but I don't like the notion of it. No more does David. "Oh, I dare say you will like it when you get in, Mrs. Hill, and David too." "It is to be hoped so, sir." The day went on, and its after events I can only speak of from hearsay. Hill moved in a good many of his goods, David carrying some of the lighter things. Luke McIntosh was asked to go and sleep in the house that night as a safeguard against thieves, but he flatly refused, unless someone slept there with him. Hill ridiculed his cowardice, and finally agreed that David should bear him company. He made the bargain without his wife. She had other views for David. Her intention was to send the lad over to Worcester by the 7 o'clock evening train. Not so much because his bed and bedding had been carried off and there was nothing for him to sleep on, as that his dying grandmother had expressed a wish to see him. To hear then that David was not to go did not please Mrs. Hill. It was David himself who carried in the news. She had tea waiting on the table when they came in. David first, for his stepfather had stopped to speak to someone in the road. "But, David dear, you must go to Worcester," she said when he told her. "He will never let me, mother," was David's answer. "He says the things might be stolen if nobody takes care of them, and Mackintosh is afraid to be there alone." She paused and looked at him, a thought striking her. The boy was leaning upon her in his fond manner, his hand in hers. "Should you be afraid, David?" "Not, I think, with Luke. We are to be in the same room, mother." But Mrs. Hill noticed that his voice was hesitating. His small, weak hand trembled in hers. There was not a more morally brave heart than David Garth's. He had had a religious training, but at being alone in the dark, he was a very coward, afraid of ghosts and goblins. "Hill," said she to her husband when he stamped in, the lad having gone to wash his hands, "I cannot let David sleep in the other house tonight. He will be too timid." "Timid," repeated Hill, staring at the words. "Why, Luke McIntosh will be with him. David won't like it. Mackintosh is nothing but a coward himself." "Don't thee be a fool, and show it," returned Hill roughly. "Thee'll keep that boy a baby for his life. Davy would as soon sleep in the house alone as not, but for the folly put into his head by you." "And why not?" "He's 14. Hill, To give him his due, only spoke as he thought. That anyone in the world, grown to 14 and upwards, could be afraid of sleeping in a house alone was to him literally incomprehensible. I said he must go over to Worcester to see Mother James. She meekly resumed, "You know I did. Well, he can't go tonight. He shall go in the morning. There! He may stop with her for a week, and ye like, for all the good he is to me. Mother's looking for him tonight, and he ought to go. The dying. Now just you drop it, for he can't be spared," interrupted Hill. "The goods might be stole, with all the loose characters there is about, and that fool of a Mackintosh won't go in of himself. He's a regular coward. Davy must keep him company. It's not so much he does for his keep, and he may start for Worcester by daylight." Whenever Hill came down upon her with this resolute decision, it struck her timid forthwith. The allusion to the boy's keep was an additional thrust, for it was beginning to be rather a sore subject. An uncle at Worcester, who had no family and was well-to-do, had partly offered to adopt the lad, but it was not yet settled. Davy was a great favorite with all the relatives. Miss Timmins, the schoolmistress, doted on him. Mrs. Hill, not venturing on further remonstrance, made the best of the situation. "Davy, you are to go to Worcester the first thing in the morning," she said, when he came back from washing his hands. "So as soon as you've been home and had a bit o' breakfast, you shall run off to the train. Tea over." Hill went out on some business, saying he should be in at 8 or thereabouts, to go with Davy to the cottage. As the hour drew near, David, sitting over the fire with his mother in pleasant talk, as they loved to do, asked if he should read before he went, for her habit was to read the Bible to him, or cause him to read to her the last thing. "Yes, dear," she said. "Read the 91st Psalm." So David read it. Closing the book when it was over, he sat with it on his knee, thoughtfully. "If we could only see the angels, Mother! It is so difficult to remember always that they're close around, taking care of us. So it is, Davy. Most of us forget it. When life's over, it will be so pleasant for them to carry us away to heaven. I wish you and I could go together, Mother. We shall each go when God pleases, David." "Oh, yes, I know that." Mrs. Hill, remembering this little bit of conversation, word for word, repeated it afterwards to me and others, with how they had sat and David's looks. I say this for fear people might think I had invented it. Hill came in, and they prepared to go to the other house. David, his arms full, for of course with things to be carried, they did not go out empty-handed, came suddenly back from the door and going out, flung his load down and clasped his mother. She bent to kiss him. "Good night, my dear one. Don't you and Luke get chattering all night. Go to sleep betimes." He burst into tears, clinging to her with sobs. It was as if his heart were breaking. "Are you afraid to go?" she whispered. "I must go," was his sobbing answer. "Now then," Davy called back Hill's rough tones. "What the plague are you lagging for? Say good-bye to me, Mother. Say good-bye. Good-bye. And God bless you, David. Remember the angels are around you." I know." Taking up his bundles, he departed, keeping some paces behind Hill all the way, partly to hide his face, down which the tears were raining, partly in his usual awe of that formidable functionary who stood to him as a stepfather. Arrived at the house, Hill was fumbling for the key, when someone came darting out from the shadow of its eaves. It proved to be Luke Mackintosh. "I was looking round for you," said crusty Hill. "I began to think you'd forgot the time o' meeting." "No, I'd not forgot it, but I be come to say that I can't oblige you by sleeping there," was Luke's reply. "The master have ordered me off with the wagon afore dawn, and so I may going to sleep at home. Had I been there, I could have said the master had not ordered Luke off before dawn, but after his breakfast. It was just a ruse of his, to avoid doing what he had never relished, sleeping in the house." Hill suspected as much, and went on at him, mockingly asking if he was afraid of hobgoblins. Luke dodged away in the midst of it, and Hill relieved his anger by a little hot language. "Come along, Davy," said he at last. "We must put these here things inside." Unlocking the door, he went in, and the first thing fell against something or other in the dark. Hill swore a little at that, and struck a light, the fire having gone out. This lower room was full of articles, thrown down out of hand. The putting things straight had been left to the morrow. "Carry the match afore me, Davy." These blankets must go upstairs. By some oversight, no candles had been taken to the house, only the box of matches. David lighted one match after the other, while Hill arranged the blankets on the mattress for sleeping. This room, the one with the skylight, was to be David's. "There," said Hill, taking the box of matches from him. "You'll be comfortable here till morning. If you find it cold, you might keep on your trousers." David Garth stood speechless, a look of horror struggling to his face. In that first moment, he dared not remonstrate. His awe of Hill was too great. "What's the matter now?" asked Hill, striking another match. "What ails you? You'll not leave me here, all by myself?" whispered the unhappy boy, in desperate courage. "Not leave you here by yourself? Why, what do you think is to harm you? Don't you try on your nonsense and your games with me, Master Davy. I'm not soft like your mother. Say your prayers and get to sleep, and I'll come and let you out in the morning." By a dexterous movement, Hill got outside and closed the door softly, slipping the bolt. The match in his fingers was nearly burnt out. Nevertheless, it had shown a last faint vision of a boy kneeling in supplication, his hands held up, his face one of piteous agony. As Hill struck another match to light the staircase, a wailing cry mingled with the sound. Entreaties to be let out, prayers not to be left alone, low moans telling of awful terror. "Drat the boy! This comes of his mother's coddling. Hold your row, Davy," he roared out wrathfully. "You'd not like me to come back and give you a basting." And Mr. James Hill, picking his way over the bundles, locked the outer door and betook himself home. That was our respectable bailiff. "What do you think of him? Did you leave Davy comfortable?" asked Mrs. Hill when he got back. "He'll be comfortable enough when he's asleep," shortly answered Hill. "Of all hardened, ungrateful boys, that of yourn's the worst. Had Luke come when you got there?" she resumed, passing over the aspersion on Davy. "He was waiting. He came right out upon us like an apparition," was Hill's evasive answer. And he did not tell the rest. But now a singular thing happened that night. Mrs. Hill was in a sound sleep when a loud, agonized cry of "Mother" aroused her from it. She started up, wide awake instantly, and in terror so great that the perspiration began to pour off her face. In that moment the call was repeated. The voice was David's voice. It had appeared to be in the room, close to her, and she peered into every corner in vain. Then she supposed it must have come through the window, that David, from some cause or other, had come home from Willow Brook and was waiting to be let in. A dread crossed her of Hill's anger, and she felt inclined to order the boy to go back again. Opening the casement window, she called to him by name, softly at first, then louder. There was no answer. Mrs. Hill stretched out her head as far as the narrow casement allowed, but neither David nor anyone else could she see. Nothing but the shadows cast by the moonlight. Just then the old church clock struck out. She counted the strokes and found it 12. Midnight. It was bitterly cold. She closed the window at last, concluding David had gone off from fear of being punished. All she could hope was that he would have the sense, that dangerously keen night, to run off to the brick kilns and get warm there. But the terror lay upon her yet. She was unable to tell why or wherefore, unless from the strangely appealing agony of the cry. Still less could she shake it off. It seemed odd. Hill awoke with the commotion and found her trembling. "What have you got to be affrighted on?" he asked roughly when she had told her tale. And Mrs. Hill was puzzled to say what. "You have been dreaming of him. That's what it was. You've got nothing else in your mind, day nor night, but that their boy. It was not a dream. I am quite positive it was himself. I could not mistake his voice," persisted Mrs. Hill. "He has come away from the cottage, for sure. Perhaps that Luke McIntosh might have got teasing him. Knowing what Hill knew, that the boy was locked in, he might safely have stood out that he could not have come away from it. But he said no more. Rolling himself round, he prepared to go to sleep again, resentful at having been awakened. Hill overslept himself in the morning, possibly through the interrupted rest. When he went out, it was broad daylight. David Garth's being locked up half an hour more or less went for nothing with Hill, and he stayed to load the truck with some of the remainder of his goods. "Send Davy home at once, James," called out the wife, as he began to wheel it away. I'll give him his breakfast and let him start off to the train, for with daylight and the sight of the door key, Mrs. Hill could only reverse her opinion and conclude unwillingly that it might have been a dream. Hill showed her the key, telling her that he had locked the door for safety. Therefore, it appeared to be impossible that David could have got out. The first thing Hill saw when he and his truck approached the cottage was young Jim Batley, mounted on the roof and hammering away at the skylight with his freezing hands. Jim, a regular sailor for climbing, had climbed a tree and then swung himself onto the tiles. Hill treated him to some hard words and ordered him to come down and get a licking. Down came Jim, taking care to dodge out of Hill's reach. "I can't make David here," said Jim. "I've got to go to Timberdale, and I want him to go along with me." "That's no reason why you should get atop of my roof," roared Hill. "You look out for a sweet hiding, young Jim. The first time I get hold on you, you shall have it kindly." "He sleeps uncommon hard," said Jim. "One you'd think the cold had froze him. I've got to take a letter to my uncle's at Timberdale. We shall find a jolly good hot breakfast when we get there." Hill condescended to abate his anger so far as to inform Jim Batley that David could not go to Timberdale, adding that he was going off by train to see his grandmother at Worcester. Ordering Jim to take himself away, he unlocked the door and entered the cottage. Jim Batley chose to stay. He was a tall, thin, obstinate fellow of 11 and meant to wait and speak to David. Given to following his own way whenever he could, in spite of his father and mother, it occurred to him that perhaps David might be persuaded to take Timberdale first and the train after. He amused himself with the dead leaves while he waited, but it seemed that David took a long time dressing. The truck stood at the door. Jim stamped and whistled and shied a few stones at the topmost article, which was Mrs. Hill's potato saucepan. Presently Hill came out and began to unload, beginning with the saucepan. "Where's Davy?" demanded Jim from a safe distance. "Ain't he ready yet?" "Now if you don't get off about your business, I'll make you go," was Hill's answer, keeping his back turned to the boy. "You haven't got nothing to stop here for." "I'm stopping to speak to Davy." Davy was away out here afore daylight and took the first train to Worcester. "He's a'most there by now." Young boys are not clever reasoners, but certain contradictory odds and ends passed through Jim's disappointed mind. For one thing, he had seen Hill unlock the door. "I don't think he's gone out yet. I see his boots." "What boots?" asked Hill, putting a bandbox inside the door. "Davy's. I see 'em through the skylight. They stood near the mattress. Them was a pair of my boots as I carried here last night. I tell ye, Davy's gone. Can't ye believe? He won't be home for some days neither, for his grandmother's safe to keep him." Jim Batley went off slowly on his way to Timberdale. There was nothing to stay for, Davy being gone. Happening to turn round, he caught Hill looking after him and saw his face for the first time. It had turned white as death. The contrast was very remarkable, for it was usually of a deep red. "Well, I never," cried Jim, halting in surprise. "Mayhap the cold have took him. Serve him right." When Hill had got all the things inside, he locked himself in, probably not to be disturbed while he arranged them. Mrs. Hill had been waiting breakfast ever so long when she heard the truck coming back. "Whatever's become of David," she began. "I expected him home at once." "David has started for Worcester," said Hill. "Started for Worcester? Without his breakfast?" "Now don't you worry yourself about petty things," returned Hill, crustily. "You wanted him to go, and he's gone. He won't starve. Let him alone for that." The notion assumed by Mrs. Hill was that her husband had started the boy off from the cottage direct to the train. She felt thoroughly vexed. He had all his old clothes on, Hill. "I would not have had him go to Worcester in that plight for any money. You might have let the child come home for a bit of breakfast and to dress himself. There was not so much as a brush and comb at the place to make his hair tidy." "There's no pleasing you," growled Hill. "Last night you were a'most crying, 'cause Davy couldn't be let go over to see your mother. And now that he is gone, that don't please ye. Women be the very deuce for grumbling." Mrs. Hill dropped the subject. There could be no remedy, and gave her husband his breakfast in silence. Hill seemed to eat nothing, and looked very pale, at moments ghastly. "Don't you feel well?" she asked. "Well, I'm well enough. What should ail me, barring the cold? It's as sharp a frost as ever I was out in. Drink this," she said, pouring him out another cup of hot tea. It is cold, and I'm sorry we've got it so for our moving. What time shall we get in today, Hill? Not at all. Not at all, repeated the wife in surprise. No, not at all, was Hill's surly confirmation. What with you disabled, and Davio no use, things is not as forward as they ought to be. I've got to be off to my work too, pretty quick, or the squire'll be about me. We shan't get in till tomorrow. But nearly all our things are in, she remonstrated. There's as good as nothing left here. I tell you we don't go in afore tomorrow, said Hill, giving the table a thump. Can't he be satisfied with that? He went off to his work. Mrs. Hill, accepting the change as inevitable, resigned herself and borrowed a saucepan to cook the potatoes for dinner. She might have spared herself the trouble. Her husband did not come in for any. He bought a penny loaf and some cheese and made his dinner of it inside our home barn, Molly giving him some beer. He had done it before when very busy, but the work he was about that day was in no such hurry, and he might have left it if he would. Who is to sleep in the house tonight? His wife asked him when he got home to tea. I shall, said Hill. I won't be beholden to nobody. Mrs. Hill, remembering the experience of the past night, quaked a little at finding she should have to sleep in the old place alone, devoutly praying there might be no recurrence of the dream that had thrown her into such mortal terror. She and Davy were just alike, frightened at their own shadows in the dark. When Hill was safe off, she hurried into bed and kept her head under the clothes. Hill came back betimes in the morning, and they moved in at once. Old Coney's groom, who happened to be out with the dog-cart, offering to drive Mrs. Hill. Though her ankle was better and the distance short, she could hardly have walked. Instead of finding the house in order, as she expected, it was all sixes and sevens, the things lying about all over it. Towards evening, Hannah got me to call at Willow Brook and say she'd go there in the morning for an hour or two to help put things in order. The mistress had said she might do so. The fact was, Hannah was burning for a gossip, she and Hill's wife being choice friends. It was almost dark. The front room looked tolerably straight, and Mrs. Hill sat by the fire, resting her foot and looking out at the window, the shutters not yet closed. I'd be very thankful for her to come, Master Johnny, she said eagerly, hardly letting me finish. There's a great deal to do, and besides that, it is so lonesome here. I never had such a feeling in all my life, and I have gone into strange homes before this. It has seemed lonesome somehow. The fancy may go off in a day or two. I don't know, sir. It's to be hoped it will. Master Johnny, as true as that we are sitting here, when I got out of Mr. Coney's dog-cart and put my foot over the threshold to enter, a fit of trembling took me all over. There was no cause for it. I was not thinking of anything to give it me. Not a minute before. I was laughing, for the man had been telling me a joking story of something that happened yesterday at his master's. A strange fear seemed to come upon me all at once as I stepped over the threshold, and I began to shake from head to foot. Hill stared at me, and at last asked if it was the cold. I told him truly that I did not know what it was, except that it seemed like some unaccountable attack, for I was well wrapped up. He had some brandy in a bottle, and made me drink a drop. The fit went off, but I've had a queer, lonesome feeling on me ever since, as if the house was not one to be alone in. And you have been alone, I suppose? Every bit of the time, save when Hill came in to his dinner. I don't remember ever to have had such a feeling before in broad daylight. It's just as if the house was haunted. Not believing in haunted houses, I laughed. Mrs. Hill got up to stir the fire. It blazed, and cast her shadow upon the opposite wall. When dusk came on, I could hardly bear it. But for your coming in, Master Johnny, I should have stood at the door in the cold and watched for Hill. Things don't feel so lonely to one out of doors as in, so it seemed that I was in for a stay, anyway, till Hill arrived. After this, it would not have been very kind to leave her alone. She looked so weak and little. I've never liked the thought of moving here from the first, she went on, and then there came the accident to my foot. Some people think nothing at all of omens, Master Johnny, but I do think of them. They come oftener than is thought for too. Only so few take notice of them. I wish Davy was back. I can't bear to be in this house alone. David is at Worcester. I heard Hill say. He went yesterday morning, sir. I expected a letter from him today, and it is very curious that none have come. Davy knew how anxious I was about Mother, and he never fails to write when he's away from me. Somehow, all things are going crooked and cross just now. I had a fright the night before last. Master Johnny, and I am hardly quit of it yet. What was that? I asked her. She stared into the fire for a minute or two before she answered me. There was no other light in the room. I sat back against the wall beside the window. The shutters were still open. You might not care to hear it, sir. I should if it's worth telling. Turning from the fire, she looked straight at me while she told it from beginning to end, exactly as I have written it above. The tale would have been just the thing for Mrs. Todditley, who went in for marvels. Hill stood to it that it was a dream, Master Johnny, but the more I think of it, the less I believe it could have been one. If I had only heard the call in my sleep, or in the moment of waking, why, of course, it might have been a dream, but when I heard it the second time, it was after I awoke. I heard it as plain as I hear my own voice now. And plainer, too. But what else, except a dream, do you fancy it could have been? Well, sir, that's what is puzzling me. But for Hill's convincing me Davy could not have got out of here after he had locked him and Mackintosh in for safety, I should have said it was the boy himself, calling me from outside. It sounded in the room, close to me, but the fright I was in might have deceived me. What's that? A loud rapping at the window. I am not ashamed to say that coming so unexpectedly, it startled me. Mrs. Hill, with a shrill scream, darted forward to catch hold of my arm. Let me go. Someone wants to be let in. I dare say it's Hill. Master Johnny, I beg your pardon, she said, going back. Hill ought to know better than to come frightening me at night like this. I opened the door, and Miss Timmins walked in, not Hill. The knocking had not been intended to frighten anyone, but as a greeting to Mrs. Hill, Miss Timmins having seen her through the glass. You know you always were one of the quaking ones, Nanny, she said, scoffing at the alarm. I have just got back from Worcester, and thought you'd like to hear that mother's better. And it is well you are back, Miss Timmins, I put in. The school has been in rebellion. Strangers going by have taken it for a bear garden. That Maria Elise is just good for nothing, said Miss Timmins wrathfully. When she offered to take my place, I knew she'd not be of much use. Yes, sir. It was the thought of the school that brought me back so soon. And mother is really better, cried Mrs. Hill. I am so thankful. If she had died, and I not able to get over to her, I should never have forgiven myself. How is David? Are you getting straight, Nancy? Asked Miss Timmins, looking round the room and not noticing the question about David. Straight, and only moved in this morning. And me with this ankle. Miss Timmins laughed. She was just as capable as her sister, was the contrary. About David, added Mrs. Hill, I was so vexed that he went over in his old clothes. It was Hill's fault. Have you brought me a letter from him? How could I bring you a letter from him? Returned Miss Timmins. A letter from where? It was a minute or two before elucidation was arrived at, for both were at cross purposes. David Garth had not been at Worcester at all, so far as Miss Timmins knew, certainly not at his grandmother's. To see Mrs. Hill sink back into her chair at this information, and let her hands fall on her lap, and gaze helplessly from her frightened eyes, was only to be expected. Miss Timmins kept asking what it all meant, and where David was, but she could get no answer. So I told her what Mother Hill had just told me, about Hill sending him off to Worcester. She stared like anything. Why? Where in the name of wonder can the boy have got to? I see it all, spoke the mother then, in a whisper. Davy did find his way out of this house, and it was his voice I heard, and not a dream. I knew it. I knew it at the time. These words would have sounded mysterious to anyone given to mystery. Miss Timmins was not. She was a long, thin female, with a chronic redness on her nose and one cheek, and she was as practical as could be. Demanding what Mrs. Hill meant by not a dream, she stood warming her boots at the fire while she was enlightened. The boy is keeping away for fear of Hill tanning him, spoke Miss Timmins, summing up the question. Don't you think so, Master Ludlow? I should if I could see how he got out of the cottage, after Hill had locked him in it. Luke Mackintosh put him out at this window, said Miss Timmins decisively. Hill couldn't lock that up. They'd open the shutters and Luke would pop him out. To get rid of the boy, no doubt. Mr. Luke ought to be punished for it. I did not contradict her. Of course it might have been so, but knowing Luke, I did not think he would care to be left in the house alone. Unless, the thought flashed over me, unless Luke sent away David that he might be off himself. Amidst a good deal of uncertainty, This view seemed the most probable. "Where is David?" bemoaned Mrs. Hill. "Where is he? And with these bitter cold nights." "Now don't you worry yourself, Nanny," interrupted strong-minded Miss Timmins. "I'll see to David, and bring him home, too." Hill's cough was heard outside. Miss Timmins, who had been in a dead rage at the marriage and consequently hated Hill like poison, hastened to depart. We went away together, passing Hill by the dried-up brook. He looked stealthily at us and threw back a surly good night to me. "I'm sure I don't know where I am to look for the boy first," began Miss Timmins as we went along. "Poor fellow, he is keeping away out of fear. It would not surprise me if Mackintosh is taking care of him. The man's not ill-natured. I don't understand why Hill should have told his mother David was gone to Worcester, unless he did go. Neither did I. David never went to Worcester. Rely upon that, Master Ludlow," was her answer. "He is well known at Shrub Hill Station, and I could not have failed to hear of it for one of the porter's lodges in Mother's house. Besides, David would have come down to us at once. Good night, sir. I dare say he will turn up before tomorrow." She went on towards the schoolhouse, I the other way to Crabcott. Mrs. Todditley and the squire were talking together by the blazing fire, waiting until old Thomas announced dinner. "Where have you been lingering this cold evening, Johnny?" began the squire. "Don't you get trying the pond, sir. The ice is not wafer thick yet." Kneeling on the rug between them, holding my hands to the warmth, I told where I had been and what I had heard. Mrs. Todditley, who seemed to have been born with a sympathy for children, went into lamentation over. It was what she said. "That poor little gentle lamb, David. Mackintosh is about somewhere," spoke the squire, ringing the bell. "We will soon hear whether he knows what has become of the boy." Thomas was ordered to find Mackintosh and send him in. He came presently, shy and sheepish, as usual. Standing just inside the door, he blinked his eyes and rubbed his hands one over the other, like an idiot. It was only his way. "Do you know where David Garth is?" began the squire, who thought himself a regular QC at cross-examining. Luke stared and said no. The fact was he had not heard that David was missing. "What time was it that you put him out of the window the night before last?" Luke's eyes and mouth opened. He had no more idea what the squire meant than the man in the moon. "Don't stand there as if you were a born simpleton, but answer me," commanded the squire. "When you and David Garth were put into Hill's new cottage to take care of the things for the night, how came you to let the boy out of it? Why did you do it? Upon what plea?" "But I didn't do it, sir," said Luke. "Now don't you stand there and say that to my face, Mackintosh. It won't answer, for I know all about it. You put that poor shivering boy out at the window that you might be off yourself. That's about the English of it. Where did he go to?" "But I couldn't do it, sir," was Luke's answer to this. "I was not in the place myself." "You were not there yourself?" "No, sir, I warn't. Knowing I should have to go off with the wagon pretty early, I went down and told Hill that I should sleep at home." "Do you mean to say you did not go into Hill's place at all?" "No, sir, I didn't. I conclude Hill slept there hisself. I know nothing about it, for I don't happen to have come across Hill since. I've kept out of his way." This was a new turn to the affair. Luke quitted the room, and a silence ensued. Mrs. Todditley touched me on the shoulder. "Johnny?" "Yes," I said, wondering at the startled look in her eyes. "I hope Hill did not put that poor child into the house alone. If so, no wonder that he made his escape from it." The matter could not rest. One talked, and another talked, and before noon next day it was known all over the place that David Garth had been put to sleep by himself in the empty cottage. Miss Timmins attacked Hill with her strong tongue, and told him it was enough to frighten the child to death. Hill was sullen. He would answer nothing, and all she could get out of him was that it was no business of hers. In vain she demanded his reasons for saying the boy had gone to Worcester by the early train, whether he sent him, whether he saw him off. Hill said David did go, and then took refuge in dogged silence. The schoolmistress was not one to be played with. Of a tenacious turn, she followed out things with a will. She called in the police. She harangued people outside her door. She set the parish in a ferment. But David could not be heard of, high or low, since the midnight hour, when that call of his awoke his mother, and was again repeated. He seemed to have vanished. There arose a rumor that Jim Batley could tell something. Miss Timmins pounced upon him as he was going by the schoolhouse, conveyed him indoors, and ordered him to make a clean breast of it. It was not much that Jim had to tell, but that little seemed of importance to Miss Timmins, and he told it readily. One thing Jim persisted in, that the boots he saw through the skylight must have been David's boots. Hill had called them his, he said, but they were not big enough, not men's boots at all. Hill was looking ghastly white, as if he had had a fright, Jim added, when he told him David was gone off to Worcester. Perhaps it was in that moment that a fear of something worse than had been yet suspected dawned upon Miss Timmins. Tying on her bonnet, she came up to Crab Cot and asked to see the squire. "It is getting more serious," she said after old Thomas had shown her in. "I think, sir, Hill should be forced to explain what he knows. I have come here to ask you to insist upon it. The question is, what does he know?" rejoined the squire. "More than he has confessed," said Miss Timmins, in her positive manner. "Jim Batley stands to it that those boots must, from the size, have been David's boots. Now, Squire Todditley, if David's boots were there, where was David? That is what's lying on my mind, sir." "What did Jim Batley see besides the boots?" asked the squire. "Nothing in particular," she answered. "He said the cupboard doors stood open and hid the best part of the room. David would not be likely to run away and leave his boots behind him, unless he was in too great a fright to stop to put them on. I don't think that, sir." "What is it you wish to imply?" asked the squire, not seeing the drift of the argument. "I wish I knew myself," replied Miss Timmins candidly. "I am certain Hill has not told all he could tell. He has been deceitful over it from the first, and he must be made to explain. Look here, sir. When he got to Willow Cottage that morning, there's no doubt he thought David was in it. Very well. He goes in to call him, stays a bit, and then comes out and tells young Jim that David has gone to Worcester. How was he to know David had gone to Worcester? Who told him? The boy says, too, that Hill looked ghastly, as if he had been frightened. David must have gone somewhere, or he would have been in the room, argued the squire. He would not be likely to go back after quitting it, and his mother heard him call to her in the middle of the night. Just so, sir. But if Hill did not find him, why should he come out and assert that David had started for Worcester? Why not have said David had escaped? I'm sure I don't know. It's the boots that come over me, avowed Miss Timmins. I can't come to the bottom of them. I mean to come to the bottom of Hill, though, and make him disclose what he knows. You are his master, sir, and perhaps he will tell you without trouble, if you will please to be so good as question him. If he won't, I'll have him brought up before the bench." Away went Miss Timmins, with a parting remark that the school must be rampant by that time. The squire sat thinking a bit, and then put on his hat and greatcoat, telling me I might come with him and hear what Hill had to say. We expected to find Hill in the plowed field between his cottage and North Crab. But Hill was in his own garden. We saw him as we went along. Without ceremony, the squire opened the wooden gate and stepped in. Hill was raking the leaves together by the shed at the end of the garden. He threw down the rake when he saw us, as if startled, his red face turning white. Coming forward, he began a confused excuse for being at home at that hour of the day, saying there was so much to do when getting into a fresh place, and that he had not been well for 2 days, had had a sickness upon him. The squire, never hard with the men, told him he was welcome to be there, and began talking about the garden. "It is as rich a bit of land, Hill, as any in the parish, and you may turn it to good account if you are industrious. Does your wife intend to keep chickens?" "Well, sir, I suppose she will. Town-bred women don't understand far about 'em, though. It may be a'most as much loss as profit." "Nonsense," said the squire, in his quick way. "Loss, when you have every convenience about you. This used to be the fowl house in Hopton's time," he added, rapping the side of the shed with his stick. "Why, you've been putting a padlock on it, Hill?" For the door was fastened with a padlock, a new one, to judge by its look. Hill made no comment. He had taken up the rake again and was raking vigorously at the dead leaves. I wondered what he was shaking for. "Have you any treasures here, that you should lock it up?" "Only the watering can, sir, and a few my garden tools," answered Hill. "There's a heap of loose characters about, and nothing safe from 'em." Putting his back against the shed, the squire suddenly called on Hill to face him, and entered on the business he had come upon. Where was David Garth? Did he, Hill, know anything about him? Hill had looked pale before. I said so, But that was nothing to the frightful whiteness that took him now. Ears, lips, neck, all turned the hue of the dead. The rake shook in his grasp, his teeth chattered. "Come, Hill," said the squire. "I see you have something to say." But Hill protested he had nothing to say, except that the boy's absence puzzled him. The squire put some home questions upon the points spoken of by Miss Timmins, showing Hill that we knew all. He then told him he might take his choice, answer, or go before the magistrates. Apparently Hill saw the futility of holding out longer. His very aspect would have convicted him. As the squire said, if he had committed murder he could not have looked more guilty. Glancing shudderingly around on all sides, as though the air had phantoms in it, he whispered his version of the morning's work. It was true that he had gone to the house expecting to find David in it, and it was true that when he entered he found him flown. Not wishing to alarm the boy's mother, he told Jim Batley that David had gone by early train to Worcester. He told the mother so. As to the boots, Hill declared they were his own, not David's, and that Jim's eyes must have been deceived in the size. And he vowed and declared he knew no more than this, or where David could have got to. "What do you think you deserve for locking the child in the house by himself?" asked the squire, sternly. "Everything that'll come upon me through it," readily acknowledged Hill. "I could cut my hands off now for having done it, but I never thought he'd be really frightened. It's just as if his ghost had been haunting me ever since. I see him a following of me everywhere." "His ghost!" exclaimed the squire. "Do you suppose he is dead?" "I don't know," said the man, passing his shaking hand across his damp forehead. "I wish to heaven I had let him go off to his grandmother's that same blessed night." "Then you wish me to understand, Hill, that you absolutely know nothing of where the boy may be?" "Nothing at all, sir." "Don't you think it might have been as well if you had told the truth from the first?" asked the squire, rather sarcastically. "Well, sir, one's mind gets confused at times, and I thought of his mother. I could not be off seeing that if anything had happened, it lay on my shoulders for having left him alone in there." Whether the squire believed Hill could tell more, I don't know. I did. As we went on to the schoolhouse, the pater kept silence. Miss Timmins was frightfully disappointed at the result, and said Hill was a shifty scoundrel. "I cannot tell what to think," the squire remarked to her. "His manner is the strangest I ever saw. It is just as though he had something on his conscience. He said the boy's ghost seemed to haunt him. Did you notice that, Johnny?" "Yes, sir. A queer idea. He never could have found David dead in the morning," cried Miss Timmins in a low tone, herself turning a little pale. "Dead of fright?" "That could not be," said the squire. "You forget that David had made his escape before midnight, and was at his mother's, calling to her." True, assented Miss Timmins. "Anyway, I am certain Hill is somehow or other deceiving us, and he is a born villain for doing it. But Hill, deceiving us though he had been, could not hold out. In going back, we saw him leaning over the palings waiting for us. But that the man is living yet, I should have said he was going to die there and then, for he looked exactly like it. It seemed that just after we left him, a policeman had made his appearance. Not as a policeman, but as a friend, for he and Hill were cronies. He told Hill confidentially that there was going to be a row over their lost boy, that folks were saying that he might have been murdered, that unless Hill could tell something satisfactory about him, he and others might be in custody before the day was over. Whether Hill found himself brought to a point from which there was neither advance nor retreat, or that he inevitably saw that concealment could no longer be maintained, or that he was stricken to despair and felt helpless, I know not. There he stood, his head over the palings, saying he would tell all. It was a sad tale to listen to. Miss Timmins's last supposition was right. Hill, upon going up to release David Garth, had found him dead. And, so far as the man's experience of death went, he must have been dead for 6 or 7 hours. "I'd like you to come and see him, sir," panted Hill. Gingerly stepped the squire in Hill's wake across the garden to the shed. Unlocking the door, Hill stepped back for us to enter. On a mattress on the ground was David, laid straight in his everyday clothes and covered with a blanket, his pretty hair, which his mother had so loved, carefully smoothed. Hill, rough, burly, cross-grained Hill, burst into tears and sobbed like a child. "I'd give my life to undo it and bring him back again, squire. I give my life twice over, Master Johnny. But I declare before heaven, I never thought to harm the boy. When I see him the next morning, lying dead, I'd not have minded if the Lord had struck me dead too. I've been a'most mad ever since. Johnny, said the squire, in low tones, go you to South Crab, and bring over Mr. Cole. Do not talk of this. The surgeon was at home, and came back with me. I did not quite understand why the squire sent for him, seeing he could do no good. And the boots were David's, after all, the only things he had taken off. Hill had brought him to this shed the next night, with some vague idea of burying him in the ground under the leaves. But I couldn't do it, he avowed amid his sobs. I couldn't do it. There was an examination, Cole and another making it, and they gave evidence at the inquest. One of them, it was Cole, thought the boy must have died from fright, the other from the cold, and a nice muff this last must have been. I did not from the first like that midnight call, or the apparently causeless terror the poor mother awoke in, said Mrs. Todditley to me. The child's spirit must have cried out to her in his death agony. I have known a case like this before. But, hold your tongue, Johnny. You have not lived long enough to gain experience of these things. And I held it. Chapter 20. David Garth's Ghost. Is it true that she's going to marry him, Miss Timmins? True. I don't know, retorted Miss Timmins in wrath. It won't be for lack of warning, if she does. I told her so last night, and she tossed her head in answer. She's a vain, heartless girl, Hannah Baber, with no more prudence about her than a female ostrich. There may be nothing in it after all, said Hannah. She is generally ready to flirt, you know. Flirt, shrieked Miss Timmins in her shrillest tone. She'd flirt with a two-legged wheelbarrow if it had trousers on. This colloquy was taking place at the private door of the schoolhouse. And you must understand that we have gone back a few months, for at this time David Garth was not dead. Hannah, who had gone down from Crabcott on an errand, came upon Miss Timmins standing there to look out. Of course she stayed to gossip. The object of Miss Timmins's wrath was her niece, Harriet Rowe, a vain, showy, handsome, free-natured girl, as you have heard, with bright dark eyes and white teeth, who had helped to work the mischief between Maria Leese and Daniel Farrer, which had led to Farrer's dreadful death. Humphrey Rowe, Harriet's father, was half-brother to Miss Timmins and Mrs. Hill. He had settled in France and married a Frenchwoman. Miss Harriet chose to call herself French and politely said the English were not fit to tie that nation's shoes. Perhaps that was why she had now taken up with a cousin, Louis Rowe. Not that Louis Rowe was really French. He had been born in France of English parents, and so was next door to it. A fashionable-looking young man North Crab considered him, for he wore well-cut coats and a mustache. A mustache was a thing to be stared at in simple country places then. It may have had something to do with Miss Timmins's dislike to the young man. Louis Rowe was only a distant relative, a 10th cousin, or so, of whom Miss Timmins had heard before but never seen. When he appeared unexpectedly one January day at the schoolhouse, it was the January after Daniel Farrer's death, ostensibly to see Harriet, whom he had known in France. Miss Timmins, between surprise and the mustache, was less gracious than she might have been. From that time to this March, he had, as Miss Timmins put it, haunted the place, though chiefly taking up his abode at Worcester. Harriet had struck into a flirtation with him at once, after her native fashion, and now it was reported that they were going to be married. Miss Timmins could not find out that he was doing anything for a living. He talked of his fine affairs over in France, but when she questioned him of what nature that affairs were, he either evaded her like an eel or gave rambling answers that she could make neither head nor tail of. The way in which he and Harriet would jabber French in her presence, not a word of which language could she comprehend, and the laughing that went on at the same time put Miss Timmins's back up worse than anything, for she thought they were making game of her. She could be tart when she pleased, and when that happened, the redness in the nose and cheek grew redder. Very tart indeed was she, recounting these grievances to Hannah. My firm belief, Hannah Baber, is that he wants to get hold of Harriet for her £200. She has that much, you know, it came to her from her mother. Rowe would rather play the gentleman than work. It is the money he's after, not Harriet. The money may put him into some good way of business, and they may live comfortably together, suggested Hannah. Pigs may fly, returned Miss Timmins. There's something in that young man, Hannah Baber, that I could not trust. Oh, but girls are willful and simple, at the best, where the men are concerned. They can't see an inch beyond their noses. No, and they won't let others who have sight see for them. Look there! Emerging into the spring sunshine from the Withy Walk came the gentleman in question, Harriet Rowe and her gay ribbons at his side. Miss Timmins gave her door a bang, regardless of good manners, and Hannah pursued her way. The road thus paved for it. North Crab Church was not taken by surprise when it heard the marriage banns read out one Sunday morning between Lewis Rowe of the parish of St. Swithin, Worcester, he was staying there at the time, and Henrietta Del Marie Rowe. Miss Timmins, who had not been taken into confidence, started violently. Mademoiselle Henrietta Del Marie, sitting by her side, held up her head and her blooming cheeks with unruffled equanimity. It was said there was a scene when they got home. Miss Timmins' sister, once Mrs. Garth, but then our bailiff's wife, James Hill, looking in at the schoolhouse to assist at it. Neither of them could make anything of Harriet. "I'll tell you what it is, Aunt Susan and Aunt Nancy," said the girl passionately, when her temper got roused. "My mind is made up to marry Lewis. And if you don't drop this magging now and for good, if you attempt to worry me any further, I'll go off to Worcester and stay with him till the day arrives." "There! How would you like that?" "I will. I declare. It would be thought nothing at all of in my country, with the wedding so near. This shut them up." Mrs. Hill, a meek, gentle little woman who had her sorrows and habitually let Miss Timmins do all the talking when they were together, began to cry. Harriet ate her cold dinner standing and went off for an afternoon promenade with Monsieur Lewis. From that time, even Miss Timmins gave up all thought of opposition, seeing that events must take their course. Harriet's parents were dead. She was over age, and her own mistress in the eye of the law. "Would you mind taking a turn with me in the Withy Walk, Harriet Rowe?" asked Maria Elise, as they were coming out of church that same night. Harriet was alone. Lewis Rowe had gone back to Worcester. The request surprised her considerably. Since Daniel Farrer's death the past November, Maria had been very distant with her, averting her head if they happened to meet. "So you have come to your senses, have you, Maria Elise?" was the half-insolent, half-good-natured answer. "I'll walk down it with you if you like." "Come to my senses in what way?" asked Maria, in low, subdued, sad tones as they went towards the Withy Walk. "About, you know what? You blamed me for what happened. As good as laid his death at my door. Did you ever hear me say so?" "Oh, I could see." "Your manner was enough. As if I either helped it on or could have prevented it. We used to have just a bit of talking and laughing together, he and I, but that was all. That's all." And the gold chain was still on Harriet's neck. Maria suppressed a sigh. "Whether I blamed you for it, Harriet Rowe, or whether I blamed myself, is of no moment now. The past can never be recalled or redeemed in this world. Its remembrance alone remains. I want to do you a little service, Harriet. Nothing may come of it, but it is my duty to speak." Amidst the shadows of the withy beds, under the silent stars, Maria spoke, dropping her voice to a whisper. In a sufficiently curious but accidental manner, she had heard something said the previous week about Lewis Rowe. A stranger, who had known him in France, spoke very much in his disfavor. He said that any girl, if she cared for her future happiness and credit, would be mad to unite herself to him. Maria had asked no particulars. They might not have been given if she had, but the impression of Lewis Rowe left on her mind was not a good one. All this she quietly repeated to Harriet. It was received in anything but a friendly spirit. "Thank you for nothing, Maria Elise. Because you lost your own husband. That was to have been. You think you'll try what you could do to deprive me of mine. A slice of revenge, I suppose. But it won't succeed." "Harriet, you are mistaken," rejoined Maria, and Miss Harriet thought she had never in her life heard so mournfully sad a tone as the words were spoken in. "So much self-reproach fell upon me that bitter evening when he was found dead, reproach that can never be lifted from me while time shall last, that I do not think I can ever again do an ill turn in this life, or give an unkind word. The whole world does not seem to be as sinful in its wickedness as I was in my harsh unkindness, and there's no sort of expiation left to me. If I pass my whole existence laying my hands under other people's feet in humble hope to serve them, it cannot undo the bitterness of my passion when I exposed him before Johnny Ludlow. The exposure was more than he could bear, and he put an end to it. I suffer always. Harriet Rowe. My days are one prolonged, burning agony of repentance. Repentance that brings no relief. My goodness, cried Harriet, her breath almost scared away at hearing this, careless-natured though she was. I'll tell you what, Maria, I should turn Roman Catholic in your place, and let a priest absolve me from the sin. A priest absolve her from the sin. The strange anguish on her compressed lips was visible as Maria Lease turned her face upwards in the starlight. One most high and merciful priest was ever there, who could and would wash out her sin. But what of Daniel Farrer, who had died in his? If there is one person whom I would more especially seek in kindness to serve, it is you, Harriet, she resumed, putting her hand gently on Harriet's arm, and her fingers accidentally touched the chain that Daniel Farrer had hung round the girl's neck in his perfidy. Revenge? From me? The very idea of my giving up Lewis is absurd, was Harriet's rejoinder, as they came out of the Withy Walk. Thank you all the same, Maria Lease, and there's my hand. I see now that you meant kindly, but no one shall set me against my promised husband. Maria shook the hand in silence. Look here, Maria, don't go and tell your beautiful scandal to sharp Susan Timmins. Not that I care whether you do or not, except on the score of contention. She would strike up fresh opposition, and it might come to scratching and fighting. My temper has borne enough. One can't be a lamb always. The wedding came off on Easter Tuesday. Harriet wore a bright silk dress, the color of lilac, with a wreath and veil. When the latter ornaments came home, Miss Timmins nearly fainted. Decent young women in their station of life were married in bonnets, she represented, not in wreaths and veils. But Harriet Rowe, reared to French customs, said bonnets could never be admissible for a bride, and she'd sooner go to church in a coal scuttle. The Batley girls in trains and straw hats were bridesmaids. Miss Timmins wore a new shawl and white gloves, and poor little David Garth, who was to die of fright before that same year came to an end, stood with his hand locked in his mother's. And so, in the selfsame church where she had sat displaying her graces before the ill-fated Daniel Farrer, and by the same young clergyman who had preached to her then, Harriet became the wife of Lewis Rowe and went away with him to London. The next move in the chain of events was the death of David Garth in Willow Cottage. It occurred in November, when Todd and I were staying at home, and has been already told of. James Hill escaped without punishment. It was said there was no law to touch him. He protested through thick and thin that he meant no harm to the boy. To do him justice, it was not supposed he had. He was finally repentant for it, and escaped with a reprimand. Mrs. Hill refused to remain in the cottage. What with her innate tendency to superstition, with the real facts of the case, and with that strange belief that David's spirit had appeared to her in the moment of dying, a belief firm and fixed as adamant, she passed into a state of horror of the dwelling. Not another night could she remain in it. The doctor himself, Cole, said she must not. Miss Timmins took her in as a temporary thing, until the furniture could be replaced in their former house, which was not let. Hill made no objection to this. For that matter, he seemed afraid of the new place himself, and was glad to get back to the old one. All his native surliness had left him for the time. He was as a subdued man whose tongue has departed on an excursion. You see, he had feared the law might come down upon him. The coroner's inquest had brought in a safe verdict. All Hill received was a censure for having locked the boy in alone, but he could not yet feel sure that the affair would not be taken up by the magistrates, and the parish said in his hearing that his punishment ought to be transportation at the very least. Altogether, it subdued him. So, as soon as David's funeral was over, and while his wife was still with Miss Timmins, Hill began to move back his goods in a sort of humble silence. Crowds collected to see the transport, much to Hill's annoyance and discomfiture. The calamity had caused intense excitement in the place, and Miss Timmins, who had a very long tongue and hated Hill just as much as she had loved David, kept up the ball. Hill's intention was to lock up Willow Cottage until he could get Mr. Todd Hitley to release him from it. At present he dared not ask. All of us at Crab Cot, from the squire downwards, were bitterly against him for his wicked inhumanity to poor David. Curious to say, curious because of what was to happen out of it. As Hill was loading the truck with the last remaining things, a stranger came up to the cottage door. Just at the first moment, Hill did not recognize him. He had shaved off his mustache and whiskers and grown a beard instead. And that alters people. How are you, Hill? What are you up to here? It was Louis Rowe, who had married Mademoiselle Henriette the previous Easter. Where they had been since, or what they had done, was a sort of mystery, for Harriet had written only one letter. By that letter, it was gathered that they were flourishing in London, but no address was given, and Miss Timmins had called her a heartless jade, not to want to hear from her best relatives. Hill answered that he was pretty well, and went on loading, but said nothing to the other question. Louis Rowe, perceiving sundry straggling spectators who stood peering, as if the loading of a hand-barrow with goods were a raree show, rather wondered at appearances, and asked again. Hill shortly explained then that they had moved into Willow Cottage, but his wife found it didn't suit her, and so they were moving back again to the old home. He went off with the truck before he had well answered, giving no time for further colloquy. Louis Rowe happened to come across young Jim Batley amidst the tagrag, and heard from him all that had occurred. He must be a cruel devil, to leave a timid child all night in a house alone, was Mr. Rowe's indignant comment, who, whatever his shortcomings might be in the eyes of Miss Timmins, was not thought to be hard-hearted. His mother, she sees his ghost, went on Jim Batley. Leastways, heerd it. Mr. Rowe took no notice of this additional communication. Perhaps ghosts held a low place in his creed, and he appeared to have plunged into a reverie. Starting out of it in a minute or two, he ran after Hill and began talking in a low, business tone. Hill could not believe his ears. Surely such luck had never befallen a miserable man. For here was Louis Rowe offering to take Willow Cottage off his hands, to become his, Hill's, tenant for a short time. The double rent, this, and that for the old house he was returning to, had been weighing upon Hill's mind as heavily as David weighed upon it. The man had saved plenty of money, but he was of a close nature. Squire Todditley was a generous man, but Hill felt conscious that he had displeased him too much to expect any favor at present. "What do you want of the cottage?" asked Hill, suppressing all signs of satisfaction. "Be you and Harriet a coming to live down here?" "We should like to stay here for a few weeks, say till the dead of winter's over," replied Rowe. "London is a beastly dull place in bad weather. The fogs don't agree with Harriet. I had thought of taking 2 or 3 rooms at Birmingham, but I don't know but she'll like this cottage best. If you will let me have it cheap, it would be cheap enough." For Hill named the very moderate rent he had agreed to pay the squire. Only too glad was he to get that. Rowe promised to pay him monthly. North Crab was electrified at the news. Mr. and Mrs. Rowe were coming to stay in the cottage where poor David Garth had just died. No time was lost over it, either. On the following day, some hired furniture was put into it, and Harriet herself arrived. She was looking very ill, and I'm sure if she had appeared with a beard as well as her husband, her face could not have seemed more changed. Not her face only, but her manners. Instead of figuring off in silks and ribbons, finer than the stars, laughing with everyone she met, and throwing her handsome eyes about, she wore only plain things, and went along noticing no one. Some people called it pride. Miss Timmins said it was disappointment. The first time Todd and I met her, she never lifted her eyes at all. Todd would have stayed to speak, but she just said, "Good morning, gentlemen," and went on. "I say, Johnny, there's some change there," was Todd's remark as he turned to look after her. They had been in the place about a week, and Rose seemed to keep indoors or else was away, for no one ever saw him, when a strange turn arose that was destined to set the neighborhood in an uproar. I was running past the schoolhouse one evening at dusk, and saw Maria Elise sitting with Miss Timmins by firelight. Liking Maria very much, for I always did like her, and always shall, I went bold in to them. James Hill's wife was also there, in her morning gown with crape on it, sitting right back in the chimney corner. She had gone back to Hill then, but made no scruple of leaving him alone often, and Hill, who had had his lesson, put up with it. And you would never guess, no, not though you had tried from then till midsummer, what they were whispering about, as though scared out of their seven senses. David Garth's ghost was haunting Willow Cottage. Miss Timmins was telling the story. The others listened with open mouths. She began at the beginning again for my benefit. I was sitting by myself here about this time last evening, Master Johnny, having dismissed the children and almost too tired with their worry to get my own tea, when Harriet Rowe came gliding in at the door, looking whiter than a sheet, and startling me beyond everything. "Aunt Susan," says she in so indistinct a tone that I should have boxed one of the girls had she attempted to use such. "Would you take pity on me and let me stay here till tomorrow morning? Louis went away this afternoon, and I dare not stop alone in the place all night." "What are you afraid of?" I asked, not telling her at once that she might stay, but down she sat, and threw her mantle and bonnet off, taking French leave. "I never saw her in such a state before," continued Miss Timmins vehemently, shivering and shaking as if she had an ague, and not a particle of her impudence left in her. "I think that place must be damp with the Willow Brook. Aunt," says she, "it gives me a sensation of cold." "Now don't you talk nonsense about your Willow Brooks, Harriet Rowe," says I. "You are not shaking for Willow Brooks or for cold either, but from fright." "What is it?" "Well then," says she, plucking up a bit, "I'm afraid of seeing the boy." "What boy?" says I. "Not David." "Yes, David," she says, and trembles worse than ever. "He appeared to Aunt Nancy, a sign he is not at rest, and he is as sure to be in the house as sure can be. Dying in the way he did, and lying hid in the shed as he did. What else is to be expected?" "Well, Master Johnny, this all seemed to me very odd, as I've just observed to Nancy," continued Miss Timmins. "It struck me, sir, there was more behind." "Harriet," says I, "have you seen David Garth?" But at first no satisfactory answer could I get from her, neither yes nor no. At last she said she had not seen him, but knew she should if she stayed in the house by herself at night, for that he came again, and was in it. It struck me she was speaking falsely, and that she had seen him, or what she took for him. "I know she has. I feel convinced of it," spoke up poor Mrs. Hill, tilting back her black bonnet, worn for David, to wipe the tears from her eyes. "Master Ludlow, don't smile, sir, though it's best perhaps for the young to disbelieve these solemn things. As surely as that we are talking here, my dear boy's spirit came to me in the moment of his death. I feared it might take to haunting the cottage, sir, and that's one reason why I could not stay in it." "Yes, Harriet has seen him," interposed Maria Leese in low, firm tones. "Just as I saw Daniel Farrer. Master Johnny, you know I saw him. Well, truth to say, I thought she must have seen Daniel Farrer. Having assisted at the sight, or if not at the actual sight, at the place and time and circumstance attending it, I did not see how else it was to be explained away." "Where's Harriet now?" I asked. "She stayed here last night, and went off by rail this morning to her grandmother's at Worcester," replied Miss Timmins. "Mother will be glad of her for a day or so, for she keeps her bed still." "Then who is in the cottage?" "Nobody, sir. It's locked up. Rowe is expected back tomorrow." Miss Timmins began to set her tea things, and I left them. Whom should I come upon in the road but Todd, who had been over to South Crab. I told him all this, and we took the broad path home through the fields, which led us past Willow Cottage. The fun Todd made of what the women had been saying was beyond everything. A dreary dwelling. It looked cold and deserted and solitary in the dusky night, on which the moon was rising. The back looked towards Crab Ravine and the three-cornered grove in which Daniel Farrer had taken his own life away, and to the barn where Maria had seen Farrer after death. In front was the large field, bleak and bare, and beyond, the scattered chimneys of North Crab. A lively dwelling altogether, let alone what had happened in it to David Garth. I said so. "Yes, it is a lively spot," acquiesced Todd. "Beautifully lively in itself, without having the reputation of being haunted. Let's get home to dinner, Johnny." Mr. and Mrs. Coney and Tom came in after dinner. Old Coney and the squire smoked till tea time. When tea was over, we all sat down to Pope Joan. Mr. Coney kept mistaking hearts for diamonds, clubs for spades. He had not his spectacles, and I offered to fetch them. Upon that, he set upon Tom for being lazy and letting Johnny Ludlow do what it was his place to do. The result was that Tom Coney and I had a race which should reach the farm first. The night was bright, the moon high. Coming back with the spectacles, a man encountered us, tearing along as fast as we were. And that was like mad. "Hello," cried Tom. "What's up?" Tom had cause to ask it. The man was Luke McIntosh, and never in all my life had I seen a specimen of such terror. His face was white, his breath came in gasps. Without saying "with your leave" or "by your leave," he caught hold of Tom Coney's arm. "Master, as I be a living sinner, I just seen Davy Garth." "Seen David Garth?" echoed Tom, wondering whether Luke had been drinking. "I see him as plain as plain. He be at that end window, the Willow Cottage." "Do you mean his ghost or himself?" asked Tom, making game of it. "Why, his ghost, in course, sir. It's well known his self be dead and buried. Worse luck. Mercy on us. I'd ha' lost a month's wages rather nor see this." Considering Luke McIntosh was so great a coward that he would not go through the ravine after nightfall, this was not much from him. Neither had his conscience been quite easy since David's death, as it may be said that he, through refusing at the last moment to sleep in the house, had in a degree been the remote cause of it. His account was this. Passing the Willow Cottage on his way from North Crab, he happened to look up at the end window and saw David standing there all in white in the moonlight. "I never seen nothing plainer in all my born days, never," gasped Luke. His poor little face hadn't no more color in it nor chalk. "Drat them ghosts and goblins, then. What does they come and show theirselves to decent folk for?" He was trembling just as Miss Timmins, some 3 hours before, had described Harriet Rowe to have trembled. An idea flashed into my mind. "Now, Luke, just you confess. Who is it that has put this into your head?" I asked. But Luke only stared at me. He seemed unable to understand. "Someone has been telling you this tonight at North Crab?" "Telling me what, Master Ludlow?" "That David Garth is haunting the cottage." "It is what people are saying, Tom," I added to Coney. "Then, Master Johnny, I never heard a blessed syllable on't," he replied, and so earnestly that it was not possible to doubt him. "Nobody have said nothing to me. For the matter o' that, I didn't stop to talk to a soul, but just put Molly's letter in the window slit, which was what I went for, and turned back again. I wish the woman had been skinned afore she got me to go off to the post for her tonight. Plague on me, to have took the way past the cottage. As if the road warn't good enough to serve me, and a sight straighter." "Were there lights in the cottage, Luke?" asked Coney. "Did you see the rows about?" "There warn't no more sign light or life in neither place, Mr. Tom. No more nor if they'd all been dead and buried inside it." "It is shut up, Tom," I said. "Rowe and his wife are away." "Lauk a mercy! Not a living creature in it but the ghost," quaked Luke. As I have said, this was not much from Luke, taking what he was into consideration, but it was to be confirmed by others. One of the Connie's maidservants came along, as we stood there, on her way from North Crab. A sensible, respectable woman, with no nonsense about her in general. But she looked almost as scared as Luke now. "You don't mean to say you have seen it, Dinah?" cried Tom, staring at her. "Yes, I have, sir." "What? Seen David Garth?" "Well, I suppose it was him. It was something at the window, in white, that looked like him, Mr. Tom." "Did you go on purpose to look for it, Dinah?" asked Tom ironically. "The way I happened to go was this, sir. James Hill overtook me coming out of North Crab. He was going up to Willow Cottage to speak to Rowe, and I thought I'd walk with him instead of taking the road. Not but what he's a beauty to walk with. He is, after his cruelty to his wife's boy," broke off Dinah. "But company is company on a solitary road at night. When we got to the cottage, Hill knocked. I stayed a minute to say, 'How do you do?' to Mrs. Rowe, for I've not seen her yet. Nobody answered the door. The place looked all dark and empty. 'They must be out for the evening, I should think,' says Hill, and with that he steps back and looks up at the windows. 'Lord be good to us. What's that?' says he, when he had got round where he could see the end casement. I went to him, and found him standing like a pump, just as stiff and upright, his hands clutched hold of one another, and his eyes staring up at the panes in mortal terror. 'What is it?' says I. 'It's Davy,' says he, but the voice didn't sound like Hill's voice, and it scared me a bit. 'Yes, it's him,' says Hill. 'He have got on the sheet as was wrapped round him to carry him to the shed. I lodged him again at their window to make the turning. The stairs was awkward,' went on Hill, as if he was speaking again the grain, but couldn't help himself And sure enough, Mr. Tom, sure enough, Master Ludlow, there was David. "Nonsense, Dinah," cried Tom Coney. "I saw him quite well, sir, in the white sheet," said Dinah. "The moon was shining on the window, most as bright as day." "It were brighter nor day," eagerly put in Luke McIntosh. "You'll believe me now, Mr. Tom?" "I'd not believe it if I saw it," said Tom Coney. "As we stood looking up, me laying hold of Hill's arm," resumed Dinah, as if she had not told all her tale, "there came a loud whistling and shouting behind, which was young Jim Batley, bringing some message from them sisters of his to Harriet Rowe. I bade him hush his noise, but he only danced and mocked at me. So then I told him the cottage was empty, except for David Garth. That hushed him. He came stealing up and stood by me, staring. You should have seen his face change, Mr. Tom. Was he frightened? Frightened is hardly the word for it, sir. His teeth began to chatter, as if he had a fit, and down he went at last like a stone, face first, howling fearful. We couldn't hardly get him up again to come away, me and Hill. And as to the ghost, Mr. Tom, it was still there. Well, it is a queer tale, acknowledged Tom Coney. We made for the road, all three of us then, and I turned on here, and I didn't half like coming by the barn where Maria least saw Daniel Farrer, candidly added Dinah. T'other two went on their opposite way, Jim never letting go of Hill's coattails. There was no more Pope Joan that night. We carried the story indoors, and I mentioned also what had been said to Miss Timmins. The squire and old Coney laughed. With David Garth's ghost to be seen, it could not be supposed that I, or Todd, or Tom Coney, should stay away from the sight. When we reached the place, some 20 people had collected round the house. Jim Batley had told the tale in North Crab, but curious watchers had seen nothing. Neither did we, for the bright night had changed to darkness. A huge curtain of cloud had come up from the south, covering the moon and the best part of the sky, as a pall covers a coffin. If gazing could have brought a ghost to the window, there would assuredly have been one. The casement was at the end of the house, serving to light the narrow upstairs passage. A huge cherry tree hid the casement in summer. Very slightly, its bare branches obscured it now. A sound, as of some panting animal, came up beside me as I leaned on the side palings. I turned and saw the bailiff. Some terrible power of fascination had brought him back again, against his will. "So it is gone, Hill, you see." "It's not gone, Mr. Johnny," was his answer. "For some of our sights, it'll never go away again. You look well at the right-hand side, sir, and see if you don't see some at white there." Peering steadily, I thought I did see something white, as of a face above a white garment. But it might have been fancy. Us as saw him couldn't mistake it for fancy, was Hill's rejoinder. There was 3 on us. Me, and Dinah up at Coney's, and that there imp of a Jim Batley. Someone saw it before you did, Hill? At least he says so. Luke McIntosh. He was scared out of his senses. The effect of these words on Hill was such that I quite believe he was scared out of his. He clasped his hands in wild emotion and turned up his eyes to give thanks. "It's retribution a-working its ends, Mr. Ludlow. See it first, did he? And I hope to my heart he'll see it afore his eyes evermore. If that there Mackintosh had not played a false and coward's game, no harm ud ha come to Dabby." The crowd increased. The squire and old Coney came up and told the whole assemblage that they were born idiots. Of course, with nothing to be seen, it looked as though we all were that. In the midst of it, making quietly for the back door, as though he had come home through Crab Ravine from Timberdale, I espied Lewis Rowe. Saying nothing to anyone, I went round and told him. "David Garth's ghost in the place," he exclaimed. "Why, it will frighten my wife to death. Of course there's nothing of the sort, but women are so foolishly timid." I said his wife was not there. Rowe took a key from his pocket, unlocked the back door, and went in. He was talking to me, and I stepped over the threshold to the kitchen, into which the door opened. He began feeling on the shelf for matches, and could not find any. "There's a box in the bedroom, I know," he said, and went stumbling upstairs. Down he came, after a minute or so, with the matches, struck one, and lighted a candle. Opening the front door, he showed himself, explained that he had just come home, and complained of the commotion. "There's no such thing in this lower world as ghosts," said Rowe. "Whoever pretends to see them must be either drunk or mad. As to this house, well, some of you had better walk in and reassure yourselves. You are welcome. He was taken at his word. A few came in and went looking about for the ghost, upstairs and down. Writing about it now, it seems to have been the most ridiculous thing in the world. Nothing was to be found. The narrow passage above, where David had stood, was empty. As if supernatural visitants waited while you looked for them, cried the superstitious crowd outside. It is easier to raise a disturbance of this kind than to allay it, and the ghost seers stayed on. The heavy cloud in the heavens rolled away by and by, and the moon came out and shone on the casement again. But neither David Garth nor anything else was then to be seen there. The night's commotion passed away, but not the rumors. That David Garth spirit could not rest, but came back to trouble the earth, especially that spot known as Willow Cottage, was accepted as a fact. People would go stealing up there at night, 3 or 4 of them arm in arm, and stand staring at the casement and walk round the cottage. Nothing more was to be seen, perhaps because there was no moon to light up the window. Harriet Rowe was at home again with her husband, but she did not go abroad much, and her face seemed to wear a sort of uneasy terror. The fear of seeing him is wearing her heart out. Why does Rowe stop in the place? Said North Crab. And though Harriet had never been much of a favorite, she had plenty of sympathy now. It soon came to be known in a gradual sort of way that a visitor was staying at Willow Cottage. A young woman fashionably dressed, who was called Mrs. James, and who was said to be the wife of James Rowe, Louis Rowe's elder brother. Some people declared that a man was also there. They had seen one. Harriet denied it. An acquaintance of her husband's, a Mr. Duffy, had been over to see them from Birmingham, she said, but he went back again. She was not believed. What with the ghost, and what with the mystery attaching to its inhabitants, Willow Cottage was a great card just then. If you ask me to explain what mystery there could be, I cannot do so. All I know is an idea that there was something of the kind, apart from David, dawned upon many minds in North Crab. Miss Timmins spoke it openly. She did not like Harriet's looks and said that something or other was killing her. And Susan Timmins considered it her duty to try and come to the bottom of it. At all sorts of hours, seasonable and unseasonable, Miss Timmins presented herself at Willow Cottage. Rarely alone. Sometimes Mrs. Hill would be with her, or would be Maria Leese, or one of the Batley girls, and once it was young Jim. Louis Rowe grew to feel annoyed at this. He told Harriet he would not have confounded people coming there prying, and he closed the door against them. So, the next time Miss Timmins went, she found the door bolted in the most inhospitable manner. Harriet threw open the parlor window to speak to her. Louis says he won't have any more visitors calling here just now. Not even you, Aunt Susan. What does he say that for? Snapped Miss Timmins. We came down here to be quiet. He has some accounts to go over and can't be disturbed at them. So perhaps you'll stay away, Aunt Susan. I'll come to the schoolhouse sometimes instead. It was the dusk of the evenings, but Miss Timmins could see the fearful look of illness on Harriet's face. She was also trembling. Harriet, what's the matter with you? She asked in a kinder tone. Nothing. Nothing. Why, you look as ill as you can look. You are trembling all over. It's true I don't feel very well this evening, but I think it is nothing. I often feel as if I had a touch of ague. Miss Timmins bent her face nearer. It had a strange concern in it. Harriet, look here. There's some mystery about this place. Won't you tell me what it is? I seem to be afraid for you, she concluded in a slow and scarcely audible whisper. For answer, Miss Timmins found the window slammed down in her face. An impression arose. She hardly knew whence gathered, or whether it had any foundation, that it was not Harriet who had slammed it, but someone concealed behind the curtain. Well, I'm sure, cried she. It might have taken my nose off. It was so cold, Aunt. Harriet called out apologetically through the glass. Good night. Miss Timmins walked off in dudgeon, revolving matters along the broad field path. She liked their appearance less and less. Harriet was looking as ill as possible. And what meant that trembling? Was it caused by sickness of body or terror of mind? Mrs. Hill, when consulted, summed it up comprehensively. It is David about the place. That's killing her. Harriet Rowe did not make her appearance at the schoolhouse, and the next day, but one Miss Timmins went up again. The door was bolted. Miss Timmins knocked, but received no answer. Not choosing to be treated in that way, she made so much noise, first at the door and then at the window, that the former was at length unclosed by Mrs. James, in list shoes and a dressing gown, as if her toilette had been delayed that day. The chain was kept up, a new chain that Miss Timmins had not seen before, and she could not enter. "I want to see Harriet, Mrs. James." "Harriet's gone," replied Mrs. James. "Gone? Gone where?" "To London. She went off there yesterday morning." Miss Timmins felt, as she would have said, struck into herself. An idea flashed over her that the words had not a syllable of truth in them. What did she go to London for? Mrs. James glanced over her two shoulders, seemingly in terror herself, and sunk her voice to a whisper. She had grown afraid of the place, this dark winter weather. "Miss Timmins, it's as true as you're there." Nothing would persuade her out of the fancy that she was always seeing David Garth. He used to stand in a sheet at the end of the upstairs passage and look at her. Leastways, she said so. This nearly did for Miss Timmins. It might be true, and she could not confute it. "Do you see him, Mrs. James?" "Well, no, I never have. Goodness knows, I don't want to." But Harriet was not well enough to take a long journey, contended Miss Timmins. She never could have undertaken one in her state of health. "I don't know what you mean by state, Miss Timmins." She would shake a bit at times, but we saw nothing else the matter with her. "Perhaps you would shake if you had an apparition in the house." Anyway, well or ill, she went off to London. Lewis took her as far as the station and saw her away. "Will you give me her address? I should like to write to her." Mrs. James said she could not give the address, because she did not know it. Nothing more was to be got out of her, and Miss Timmins reluctantly departed. "I should hope they've not murdered her." And her concealing her in the house, as Hill concealed David, was the comment she gave vent to in her perplexity and wrath. From that time, nothing could be heard of Harriet Rowe. A week went on, nearly 2 weeks, but she never was seen, and no tidings came of her. So far as could be ascertained, she had not gone away by train. Neither stationmaster nor porter remembered to have seen her. Miss Timmins grew as thin as a ghost herself. The subject worried her night and day. That something had happened to Harriet, or been done to her, she did not doubt. Once or twice she managed to see Rowe. Once or twice she saw Mrs. James, speaking to them at the door with the chain up. Rowe said he heard from his wife nearly every other day, but he would not show the letters or give the address. A conclusive proof to the mind of Miss Timmins that neither had any existence. What had they done with Harriet? Miss Timmins could not have been in much worse mental trouble had she herself made away with her. One morning the postman delivered a letter at the schoolhouse. It bore the London postmark and purported to be from Harriet. A few lines only, saying she was well and enjoying herself, and should come back sometime. The writing shaky and blotted, and bearing but a slight resemblance to hers. Miss Timmins dashed it on the table. "The fools to think they can deceive me this way. That's no more Harriet's writing than it is mine." But Miss Timmins's passion soon subsided into a grave, settled, awful dread. For she saw that this had been written to delude her into the belief that Harriet was in health and life, when she might be in neither one nor the other. She brought the letter to Crabcott. She took it round the parish. She went with it to the police station, imparting her views of it to all freely. It was a sham, a blind, a forgery. And where was she to look for poor lost Harriet Rowe? That same evening the ghost appeared again. Miss Timmins and others went up to the cottage, intending to demand an interview with Rowe, and they found the house shut up, apparently deserted. Reconnoitering the windows from all points, their dismayed eyes rested on something at the end casement, a thin, shadowy form robed in white. Every one of them saw it, but even as they looked, it seemed to vanish away. Yes, there was no question that the house was haunted. Perhaps Harriet had died from fright, as poor David died. Things could not go on like this forever. After another day or two of discomfort, Mr. Todditley, as a county magistrate, incited by the feeling in the parish, issued a private mandate for Rowe to appear before him, that he might be questioned as to what had become of his wife. It was not a warrant, but a sort of friendly invitation that could offend no one. Jiff the policeman was entrusted with the delivery of the message, a verbal one and I went with him. As if she had scented our errand for herself, and wanted to make a third in it, who should meet us in the broad path, but Miss Timmins. Willow Cottage might or might not be haunted, but I am sure her legs were. They couldn't be still. "What are you doing up here, Jiff?" she tartly asked. Jiff told her. Squire Toddley wanted row at Crabcot. "It will be of no use, Jiff. The door's sure to be fast," groaned Miss Timmins. "My opinion is that Roe has left the place for good." Miss Timmins was mistaken. The shutters were open, and the house showed signs of life. Upon knocking at the door, Miss Timmins took off her patent to do it with, and you might have heard the echoes at North Crab. It was flung wide by Mrs. James. "Mr. Roe?" No, Mr. Roe was not at home. Mrs. Roe was. Mrs. Roe was? "What, Harriet?" cried excited Miss Timmins. "Yes, Harriet. If we like to walk in and see her, we could do so. By the kitchen fire, as being biggest and hottest, in a chair stuffed about with blankets, sat Harriet Roe. Worn, white, shadowy, she was evidently just getting over some desperate illness. I stared. The policeman softly whistled. "You might have knocked Miss Timmins down with a feather." "Good patience, child. Why, where have you been hiding all this while?" cried she. "And what on earth has been the matter with you?" "I've been upstairs in my room, Aunt Susan keeping my bed. As to the illness, it turned out to be ague and low fever." "Upstairs where?" "Here." Jiff went out again. There was nothing to stay for. I followed, leaving Miss Timmins and Harriet to have it out together. She had really been ill in bed all the time, Mrs. James and Roe attending on her. It did not suit them to admit visitors, for James Roe, who had fallen into some difficulty in London, connected with forged bills, was lying concealed at Willow Cottage. That's why people were kept out. It would not have done by any means for Miss Timmins and her sharp eyes to go upstairs and catch a glimpse of him. So they concocted the tale that Harriet was away. James Roe was safely away now, and Lewis with him. Lewis had been mixed up in the bill trouble in a lesser degree, but quite enough so to induce him to absent himself from London for a time, and to stay quietly at North Crab. "Was it fear or ague that caused you to shake, so that last evening I saw you here?" questioned Miss Timmins. "Ague. I never got out of bed after that night. I could hardly write that letter, Aunt, that Lewis sent to London to be posted to you. And did you really see David Garth?" "No, I never saw him," said Harriet. "But, after all the reports and talk, I was timid at being in the house alone. James and his wife had not come then, and that's why I asked you to let me stay at the schoolhouse the night my husband was away. But it was told me that you did see him. I was always frightened for fear I should. It strikes me you have had other causes for fright as well." "Harriet," cried shrewd Miss Timmins. "Well, you see, this business of James Roe's has put me about. Every knock that came to the door seemed to me to be somebody coming for him. My husband says the ghost is all rubbish and fancy, Aunt Susan. Rubbish and fancy, does he? He says that when he came in here with Johnny Ludlow, the night there was that commotion, in going up for some matches, he fell over something at the top of the stairs by the end casement and flung it behind the rafters. Next day he saw what it was. I had tied a white cloth over a small dwarf mop to sweep the walls with, and must have left it near the window. I remembered that I did leave it there. It no doubt looked in the moonlight just like a white face. And that's what was taken for David's ghost." Miss Timmins paused, considering matters. She might believe just as much of this as she liked. "It appeared again at the same place, Harriet, 2 or 3 days ago. That was me, Aunt. I saw you all looking up, and drew away again for fear you should know me. Mrs. James was making my bed, and I had crawled there. There it ended. So far the mystery was over. The explanation was confided to the public, who received it differently. Some accepted the mop version, others clung to the ghost. And he'll never had a penny of his rent. Lewis Roe was away, and as it turned out, did not come back again. Mrs. James wanted to leave also, and Maria Elise took her place as nurse. Tenderly she did it too, and Harriet got well. She was going off to join her husband as soon as she could travel. It was said in France. No one knew, unless it was Maria Elise. She and Harriet had become confidential friends. "Which is the worse fate, yours or mine?" cried Harriet to Maria, half mockingly, half woefully, the day she was packing her trunk. "You have your lonely life, and your never-ending repentance for what you call your harsh sin. I have my sickness and my trouble, and I have enough of that, Maria." But Maria Elise only shook her head in answer. "Trouble and repentance are our best lot in this world, Harriet. They come to fit us for heaven." But North Crab, though willingly admitting that Harriet Rowe, in marrying, had not entered on a bed of lilies, and might have been happier had she kept single, would not, on the whole, be shaken from its belief that the ghost still haunted the empty cottage. Small parties made shivering pilgrimages up there on a moonlight night to watch for it, and sometimes declared that it appeared. Fancy goes a long way in this world.